Hey everyone, the title of this video is called, Yeah, God Provides, but what about me doing my part? And I wanted to create a video that will basically try to answer that question and this is a lot of questions that a lot of people of the world ask, or maybe they say it but don't actually believe it, or they say it, to ridicule those that are trusting God for themselves. And maybe there are genuine people out there that actually want to know if God can come through. So, my first question is, what do you mean by your part in that question? Second question, what do you leave for God? Third question, how much do you do before you leave it to God, if any? And fourth question, how do you trust, do you trust God already? That's the fourth question. Now, if you don't trust God in any way, why would you leave anything to Him? And all those questions are leaning into that one. And it's true. How many people actually rely on God? And they just live by that first part of, if you do your part. And usually from the world, their part means everything. There is no leaving it to God, because in this world it's considered irresponsible to depend on outside sources. And I'll get into that eventually. Pride dictates for man to do everything on their own without help. And you see a lot of husbands deal with that, because in this world, the world sets the man as the main provider for his family, the main breadwinner. And this man in his pride works hard for the world to consider him to be responsible. Now, if he comes into a hard time, whether he loses his job or whatever, he struggles to try to find another one, because he doesn't want people to think that it was a mistake on his part in which he lost it. So he struggles to find another job so he's not ridiculed and criticized. Now, I'll eventually speak about where this pride has come from and where it's rooted from. And this pride is through independence. And like I said, all of this screams independence from outside sources. Not only that, but it's independence from God. And this independence began when Adam took the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God said not to. They listened to the serpent, where he questioned God's words. And then man thought that he knew better than God. So he decided to take that, and from that was independence from God. From that, the man had to fight the thorns and thistles. And that was the result of their decisions. So a whole world opened up from this independence, and all these other independent thinking that has come from it. And all these rules that has come from independence, apart from God. Now, man thinks he knows better than God. He thinks that he should consult with, financial advisors. Why would he even bother seeking God? And that's the way the world is. They don't know God. They're not going to seek Him. They're going to depend on themselves to get by. Man walks independently from God in everything, in every aspect of his life, whether finding a job, going to school, to get a good paying job, or, working hard without receiving help. Like I said, man will not receive help from anyone, even God. And man is all about doing his own thing. And this comes from Romans chapter 3, verses 10 to 12. And this is all from independence. This is all the result of sin and walking in the flesh. There is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become useless. There is no one who does good. There is not even one. And Paul in Romans is basically describing exactly what man is because of the result of sin. And he basically goes into it from Romans, from sin, the results of sin, and who will deliver us from the body of sin, which is Jesus. And so this is what I want to begin from in this video, is exactly what it is for man from this independence, and how this independence began and what came about from this independence. So Paul listed it here. I'm going in more detail with this, and I'm choosing the financial aspect and what men follow apart from God, because man in this world doesn't know God can come through. He's never seen it. He's never heard about it, and he won't bother going into that direction until something bad happens in his life, and then that's when they become God focused. Now, as we see, no one seeks God. When Adam took the fruit, the Adamic mindset took over. Hence, we have the ideal man. The ideal man is the successful pattern that all men try to live their lives up to. And out of the Adamic mindset and through the ideal man, we have all these laws that come from it, like man is the main provider for his family, man must work hard for everything, he must struggle, he must not receive help. All these laws come from this independent mindset. And out of it comes cliches like, God helps those who help themselves, and if you do your part, God will do his. Now, if you who never ask God or seek him say, if you do your part, God will do his, how do you even assume that's correct? Now, if you never trusted God, why would you even say, if you do your part, God will do his, or even have that thinking? Why would you tell other people to follow in that pattern? 1 second. Now, going even further into that thinking, if you do your part, God will do his. We already said that there is none that are righteous, that man walks independently from God, that he's not going to bother to seek God. Why would they think, if you do your part, God will do his, if they've never trusted him at all? 1 second. The world says that for man to do his part, it's the equivalent of doing everything. Man is not going to leave anything to God because he doesn't want to be ridiculed. And that is the flesh of man. And you want good examples. I mean, check my other videos out and how I was criticized for my walk of faith. Now, if the world actually believed, if you do your part, God will do his, then they wouldn't have criticized me, because they would realize that I'm relying on God. And, such is the case, if God, puts it in someone's heart to trust him for an apartment, he's going to do the legwork, like fill out an application and stuff like that. But if he doesn't have money, the world's going to criticize him for not, having the money to pay it. And to rely on God would cause them to be criticized, even if God instructed that person to rely on him. So that's the independence of God coming into play. And, let's test that cliche out. If you do your part, God will do his. If you actually believe that, let's say that you have $500 in the bank, and you have a car repair coming up, but it is more than $500. So you give them $500. You've done your part, right? Can you trust God to come through for you then? Will you? Second question. If you're looking for a job and you've put out all your applications, you're doing the legwork of this job, calling to see what the status of your application is, what many call cold calling, looking for a job or whatever it is, you're doing the legwork for it, you're doing your part. Can you rely on God to come through it, or would you stress your way through it? Now, if you could never rely on God and feel your part is doing it all, you have never trusted God. To use those cliches shows that man still operates in independence from God. If you never trust in God, how can you criticize those who do? Your judgments come from the Adamic way of thinking and the laws from the ideal man. The viewpoint of the world is all about success. Those trusting in God are living for the kingdom and not the world. And that is the thing. We see the war between the flesh and the spirit. And you have two viewpoints that oppose each other. Now, a good example of this was in John chapter 3 when Jesus was talking to Nicodemus. He couldn't understand the term being born again. And Jesus said, "You are Israel's teacher and you do not understand these things? If I tell you of worldly things you don't believe me, how can you believe about heavenly things?" And so there's two viewpoints of the world that, two viewpoints that the world is not going to understand. And, it's the spiritual realm that this world doesn't believe. They're not going to understand the concepts that come from the spiritual man. And 1 second, let me pull up 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14. Now this verse explains exactly the viewpoint from the man of the world regarding the things of the Spirit. The example of Jesus and John. Jesus in the book of John, chapter 3, when he was talking to Nicodemus. But a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised, or they're spiritually discerned. Now to see from the Spirit's viewpoint and to know, you have to walk in that Spirit, and the only way to do so is being born again, like Jesus said, or being in that place to where if you're a Christian, you lose what you're depending on in order to see what God can do, surrendering your will then to Him. Then you can see from the Spirit's viewpoint. I didn't learn to trust in God until I lost everything, until I gave up my will to Him. That is when I stopped walking in the Adamic mindset and started to rely fully on God. That is when that took place. And then you start seeing things differently. Your eyes open to the fact of what God has done in Scripture, and then you start trusting Him yourself. Now, unfortunately, many cannot see what God can do, like I said, unless he loses what he depends on. It could be the job, it could be savings, it could be, loses his pride or his health. God knows what to touch in order for man to become focused on Him. Now, good examples of this, where man's hands are tied, and where those cliches, God helps those who help themselves, or if you do your part, God will do His. And it shows these cliches to be faulty, and it's the examples that I will about to give. Now, the first example is the Israelites in the desert. Man say, if you do your part, God will do His. Well, what could the Israelites do in their part, in their own part, in this whole thing? Obedience. There's nothing they could do work-wise in order to last. They couldn't surely, work in the desert. They couldn't receive pay in the desert to buy food in the desert. They were totally dependent on God to come through. And that a lot of the people of this world will have a problem with that. The next thing is Elijah at the brook when God called him to go there. He said that he would rely on birds to bring him. I think it was ravens to bring him his meat. So the world would have a problem with that because there's nothing they can do in their own part. Look at Elijah and the widow, and her using her last piece of bread for him. There was nothing they could do in their own part. It had to be God's intervention because the woman was going to make the bread and she was preparing to die with her child, but God came through. The example of Jesus and the 4,000 and 5,000, all these people came to hear him speak, and there was nothing they could do in their own situation. That they didn't apparently have money to buy bread and fish, and Jesus multiplied exactly what was there for them to eat. And there was nothing they could do in their own part to eat or anything like that. They were dependent on God. In each example, man couldn't do his own part. So it proves that cliche is faulty. God came through in each example, as you have seen, like with the Israelites in the desert. God caused manna to come down. God caused water to come from a rock. So God took care of them. And it was nothing on man's own part that made this happen. It was because of God's goodness and his love. Now, I have a question for believers. What is your opinion, for those who believe those cliches are true and accurate? What is your opinion of the way Jesus did things? Jesus said, I don't do anything unless I see the Father do it. If you honor Jesus and agree with everything, he showed complete dependence on the Father, unlike Adam, who chose independence from God. Jesus was our model. Now, if those cliches aren't in the Bible, where are they rooted from? They are rooted from the Adamic mindset, from the independence from God. And it's also rooted, which is out of the world as well. That's where all these cliches came from. And this is stated in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. Let me pull it up. Okay, so 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. Do not love the world nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life, is not of the Father, but it is from the world. The world is passing away and also its lusts, but the one who does the will of God lives forever. And you could see in these verses exactly what the world follows. The lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life. And do we not see that? How men walk in pride. Oh, I have a great paying job. I have a lot of money saved up. I have investments, and I have all these other things that people envy. And so they have this pride inside of them. And they try to push other people to have that. And this is how you can tell someone lives of the world and loves the world, is this exact attitude. And that's what John put down here, which is the boastful pride of life. Now, looking up pride in the Greek, it's called alot, and the Greek means braggadocio, which sounds like bragging. It's self-confidence, it's boasting pride. And this is not of the Father, it's of the world. And, braggadocio, alot, is the pride of life, which John said, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. This comes from the world, not from the Father. And I gave an example of exactly that. So God showed that he came through apart from man's intervention. And I had already given the examples, how God multiplied the bread and the fish, how God called manna to come down and water from a rock. And, all these examples showed that God can come through apart from man's intervention. That if man decides to rely on God, he will come through for him. But the only way that that can happen is if somebody gives their life to Christ and they stop following the thinking of this world. If Jesus is your model, we need to follow his behavior. And he said a student becomes like his teacher. And if we call ourselves Christians, then Jesus is our teacher and we are his students. So we need to become like him in trust. So I'm going to end it here, and I really hope I explained it in some way exactly where this independence comes from, where these cliches are rooted out of, and what man tends to follow. So if you have actually said those things and don't actually follow God, then you must realize that God can touch the areas in your life in which you have pride. You may have a good paying job. You may have great health that you're boasting about, but God can touch that. God can bring man down low like he did with Nebuchadnezzar, where he didn't even bother to seek God for himself. God caused him to lose his wits and his kingdom until he was able to admit that God was the God of the universe. So if you haven't relied on God and you're a Christian, go to him, surrender your will. I have plenty of videos for that, and it's the recent ones, the war against the spirit and many others. So I pray that you would actually give your trust to God so you can see him come through. So thank you for watching. God bless you.